Fox News alert now. The United States leveling perhaps the most serious charge a country can face, accusing China in the last hour and a bit of committing genocide and crimes against humanity in its repression of Uyghur Muslims. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made the announcement just a short time ago. He joins us now for an exclusive interview. Mr. Secretary, good to have you with us. Let me just read, if I could, from your statement. You said, quote, "I have determined that the People's Republic of China, under the direction and control of the Chinese Communist Party, has committed genocide and crimes against the predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minority groups." A very significant declaration, obviously one that China will oppose vigorously, but also one that sort of runs counter to what President Trump's position has been for the last couple of years.
John, thanks for having me on. This is a very serious and tragic set of actions that are taking place there in the western part of China. We've been talking and working on this for an awfully long time in the Trump administration. We have sanctioned officials. We have told businesses they couldn't bring products out of this region. We've told businesses to be very careful that they could be too close to what's taking place there, right? This is forced labor. This is forced sterilizations, forced abortions. John, the kind of things that we haven't seen in an awfully long time in this world. And we now have conducted an exhaustive review of the facts and made the determination that, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party has committed these crimes against humanity, is continuing to try and deny these people, not just the Uyghur Muslims, but other faiths as well, the simple capacity to continue to exist and to create an ethnic set of activities that we haven't seen in an awfully long time. I've referred to this over time as the stain of the century. It is truly that. And today's actions is simply a continuation of the work this administration has done to try and convince the Chinese Communist Party to cease this terrible, terrible set of human rights violations that have been taking place.
Hey everyone, it's your host, Tony. Welcome to another installment of Actually Existing Socialism. What you just heard is a clip from a Fox News segment which aired in January 2021 during the literal final days of the Trump administration. In this clip, you heard the voice of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo shortly after he declared that China, the Chinese government, was committing genocide. Also of note is that during these same last few days, Trump administration also re-added Cuba to the state sponsor of terrorism list. I previously done an episode on Cuba being placed on this list, Cal Walsh and Aaron, so I recommend you check that out when you have the chance. In this episode, we'll be finishing discussing Carlos Martinez's incredible book, East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. Carlos Martinez is an author and political activist from London, Britain. His first book, The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse, was published in 2019. Carlos is a co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, a co-founder of No Cold War, and a coordinating committee member of the International Manifesto Group. He writes regularly in the Morning Star, Global Times, and China Daily. In this third and final part of the three-part discussion of China, we'll be tackling the current propaganda war against the nation, as well as what developments in China that socialists the world over should be following. This show is 100% listener funded and a solo production, so anything you can spare to support the show on the Patreon at patreon.com/AESthepodcast will go a long way in having me continue this educational project. So shout out to my patrons. If you're unable to contribute in that way, no problem. You can help out by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter, social media at AESthepodcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Feel free to leave a review if you have the time, or even just a star rating. I recommend too checking out the back catalog when you have the chance. So we've talked now about, we've busted some myths about the way China is presented. We've learned about the poverty alleviation. With these, achievements that we've just talked about, despite these achievements, China is still portrayed as being aggressive, as being a nation which restricts the rights of the people that live in it, that provides conditions of living that aren't, one, focused on equality. So we know that these things, or not all of these things, are true, as you've just kind of explained for us, but what are some of the most prominent ways that this negative perception of China is presented to us in the West, and how is consent manufactured essentially to ramp up war essentially against China?
Yeah, well, exactly. China is facing a propaganda war, which is essentially war propaganda. To my mind, ordinary people in the West should support China. Don't we like poverty alleviation? Don't we like green development and renewable energy and biodiversity protection? Don't we like saving millions of lives in a pandemic or modern infrastructure throughout the country? In Britain, we've got this phrase levelling up to talk about fixing or the imbalance whereby like a lot of wealth is concentrated in London, and London's got decent infrastructure, but if you go to the northern parts of the country, you go to the western parts of the country, there's crumbling infrastructure and very poor services. So we've got this expression, I think there's even a government department of levelling up, but nothing ever happens. Like there's no levelling up takes place. The inequality continues to get worse. Wouldn't we like to have the sort of levelling up project that China's had over the last 15 to 20 years, whereby you can go to Xinjiang, you can go to Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, and there's like a metro system there, and there's high-speed rail that can take you from any Chinese city to any other Chinese city. Don't we agree with like a massive Asian country that was formerly one of the poorest countries in the world being able to provide good quality education and healthcare to every one of its citizens? And don't we like the fact that all of this can be achieved without war, without aggression, without domination, without killing people? Why wouldn't people in the West support all of that? And furthermore, practical and material level, like people in the West have got a lot to gain from friendly relations with China. We could use Chinese investment. We could use a massive Chinese market for our products. Like China's got a middle income population of like 500 million people. And that's what, as far as the Chinese are concerned, like that's what's on the table. Win-win cooperation is very much on the table. The ruling class has engineered this propaganda war to prevent people from supporting China, from working towards friendly and mutually beneficial relations with China. What do people actually think about China these days in the West? They think that it's engaged in a genocide in Xinjiang. They think that it's forcing Tibetan children to go to boarding schools so that they can be indoctrinated into majority Han culture and CPC ideology. They think that it's a kind of aggressive, expansionist, repressive, authoritarian power that's intent on world domination and the ultimate trope. They want to take away our freedoms. We've got these fairy stories about spy balloons, cyber hacking, and so on. So people really come to think of China as being a malevolent power. And all of this whole narrative plays pretty much exactly the same role as the notion of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or Gaddafi being on the verge of perpetrating a massacre in Benghazi. It's about softening public opinion up for initially a Cold War against China that could very well escalate into a hot war. I mean, the Xinjiang thing is particularly disgusting, particularly kind of unethical and horrifying. And it really showcases the power of propaganda in the modern age, like the levels of manufacturing of consent, because in spite of the complete absence of credible evidence, people think that the Chinese state is actually engaged in a genocide. But it's a very strange kind of genocide where population numbers of the subject population, of the Uyghur people in this case, have consistently gone up and have increased at a much faster rate for Uyghurs than for the Han people. And a genocide where Uyghur people, as well as other minority ethnicities, weren't subjected to the one China policy that was in place until 1 or 2 years ago. You don't find any refugee camps along the border with Pakistan or along the border with Kazakhstan or whatever. All you've got in terms of evidence is the very unreliable words of one guy, Adrian Zenz, who's this like German anti-communist Christian fundamentalist who literally works for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and an Australian think tank, the Australian Strategic Policy Initiative, ASPI, which was set up by the Australian government. It's funded by the US Department of Defense and the State Department and BAE Systems and Lockheed Martin, knee-deep in the military-industrial complex, has very much got a vested interest in promoting escalation with and hostility towards China. And, it's so sickening to cheapen the use of the word genocide. And Jeffrey Sachs made a really interesting and important point on that. He says, I'll just quote him quickly, "Inappropriate use of the term genocide may escalate geopolitical and military tensions and devalue the historical memory of genocides such as the Holocaust, thereby hindering the ability to prevent future genocides. It behoves the US government to make any charge of genocide responsibly, which it has failed to do here." And then, you've got this cultural genocide variation. Someone said to me recently, a friend whose grandparents died in the Holocaust, well, cultural genocide, I don't believe that's taking place in China either. But I think my grandparents would have been very happy to have been victims of cultural genocide, given what they actually suffered. So the whole expression cultural genocide is pretty ridiculous and pretty absurd. But actually, anyone who's actually been to Xinjiang can tell you, and that includes myself. I went in at the beginning of 2020. It's quite obvious that people have got freedom of religious worship. Like, you see mosques everywhere. Like, Xinjiang has got one of the highest concentrations of mosques per Muslim population of anywhere in the world. All Uyghur people speak the Uyghur language. The Uyghur language is taught in schools. You see it on every road sign. You see it in newspapers, in books, and so on. You go into a Uyghur restaurant or a Uyghur cafe and people are wearing their traditional clothing, and they don't serve alcohol as Han Chinese restaurant typically would. They don't serve pork as a Han Chinese restaurant typically would. And it's very interesting that the accusations in relation to Xinjiang all emanate from the West. Canada, I think the Canadian Parliament has labelled what's going on in Xinjiang as a genocide. The British Parliament, the US, Australia, etc. There's not a single Muslim majority country has done that. Actually, you have delegations go from Pakistan, from Palestine, from the Middle East, from North Africa. They all go to Xinjiang and they all report that actually things are going pretty great here. Human rights are protected here. Religious freedoms are protected here. Still, people believe these accusations. They're just so pervasive. To me, that's one of the reasons I talk about China a lot. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to tell the truth about China, because actually this propaganda war and this new Cold War doesn't help anyone. Like, obviously it doesn't help China, but it doesn't help Britain. It doesn't help Europe. It doesn't help Canada. It doesn't help anyone in the US even, other than a tiny few, like the military industrial complex, basically. And meanwhile, it poses the very significant risk of escalating into a much less Cold War between two nuclear powers. So, I do think that we've got to do what we can to stop people's consent from being manufactured.
Kind of add on, talking about Xinjiang here, there's a bit of course, irony in these countries, the US, Great Britain, talking about genocide because their countries were built on settler colonialism, of course, which involved the destruction of hundreds of millions of people going all the way back to the 1500s, a legacy which none of those countries have really addressed appropriately or made any kind of reparations or reparative anything restorative for those impacted populations. I was just looking this up. So it was in 2021 in which the Canadian Parliament described the treatment of Uyghurs in China as being a genocide. This is in 2021. It wasn't until 2022 that the Canadian government for the first time actually acknowledged the Indian residential school system as genocide, which involved the forced placement of Indigenous children in boarding schools that were poorly maintained. Many children died of tuberculosis and other things like that. They were taught that their cultures were inferior and that they should be erased. So this was an actual part of genocide, but the Canadian government they were even forced to do this because of the finding of the graves at different residential schools last year. So it's just very ironic and also telling that these countries don't actually care about, even if there was a genocide occurring in Xinjiang, they aren't really interested in dealing with it because they won't even deal with their own issues of that sort.
Yeah, and meanwhile, 95% plus of Tibetans can speak Tibetan. 95% plus of Uyghur people can speak Uyghur. What percentage of indigenous North Americans can speak their indigenous languages? And how many of those languages are taught in school? How many of them are protected and upheld by the state?
That is a very good point. And that even just goes back to, I've talked about this in a previous episode with Alice and Dennis Bartels. They wrote a book called When the North Was Red. They're both anthropologists. And this was a book on the northern peoples of the Soviet Union and how their societies were impacted by Sovietization, of becoming a part of the Soviet social system, included programs of affirmative action, getting people educated. Language, of course, was a huge thing. Getting resources, newspapers, media in the languages of the people. In their book, they even talk about how it even got to a point where they were creating like a text for like specific dialects and stuff like that, and they even had to stop there and be like, "Okay, we're going too far now. We're getting too concentrated here." But it was a huge, massive effort, and I believe this nationalities policy and theorization of the nationalities policy is what carried into what China is currently doing. There's a direct connection between the two, I believe.
Yeah, I'm not the expert on this, but certainly, like, the Soviet Union were kind of major trailblazers in terms of protection of minority cultures and languages and traditions. Which is not to say that there weren't problems and flaws, which ultimately fed into the deterioration and breakup of the Soviet Union. But yeah, as you say, like they literally went to incredible lengths to protect and preserve minority languages, to the point of like creating scripts for languages that were only spoken up to that point. And yeah, the Chinese certainly learned a lot from that. There are massive institutes to this day in China that are responsible for protecting Tibetan language, Uyghur language, Kazakh language, Mongolian language. I mean, there's a huge number of languages that are spoken in China other than Mandarin, which is kind of the national language. Every region has its own dialect. So people in Fujian speak Fujianese in addition to Mandarin. People in Shanghai will speak Shanghainese. People in Sichuan will speak Sichuanese, etc. People in Guangdong speak Cantonese typically. But there's also like minority ethnicities and tribes and whatnot that have their own languages. There's major efforts to protect all of those and to ensure that they continue to live on, because I think it's rightly understood as being human history that can never be recovered once it's lost. So I think they take that very seriously. And as I said, in autonomous areas such as Tibet, such as Xinjiang, then schooling takes place in the local language, the minorities' language, as well as Mandarin. So the idea is that everyone in Tibet should be able to speak Tibetan and Mandarin. Everyone in Xinjiang should be able to speak Mandarin as well as their minority language. I mean, Xinjiang is not like Uyghurs are the majority ethnicity in Xinjiang, but there's also Kazakh people, there's also Turkmen people, and so on.
So to kind of get to the end of our discussion here, what are recent developments in China that we should be following and alert to as socialists?
Yeah, it's a big question and a difficult question. I mean, in 2013, when at the 18th Congress, when Xi Jinping became General Secretary, they introduced these two centenary goals. The first one was for the centenary of the founding of the CPC. So that was 2021. And that goal was to eliminate extreme poverty by 2021, which of course they achieved and which we've talked about. The second centenary goal is for 2049, which is the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And that goal is worded as to build a great modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful by 2049. So that's kind of like, that's pretty broad and sounds pretty ambitious, but that's sort of the thinking. Like that's the overall slogan that they're reaching towards, which I guess is to build, a modern socialism, to develop beyond the primary stage of socialism, to build a level of kind of prosperity and cultural advancement and democratic spirit and level of participation that's never been achieved before. So in material terms, to reach the level of the West, to catch up with the US, with Canada, with Western Europe, etc., in terms of like people's material prosperity, and to obviously exceed them in terms of togetherness and cultural and social components, which are, to harvest the fruits that one would expect to harvest in a socialist system, in a system that's based on promoting the well-being of the people as opposed to the pursuit of private profit. obviously that's a overarching thing to bear in mind. I think, China over the last few years has really emerged as like the responsible global leader in relation to combating climate change and preventing climate breakdown. What China's doing in relation to rolling out and developing renewable energy, wind energy, photovoltaic, solar power, geothermal, nuclear, like they're making incredible advances. Not just in safe nuclear fission, but also, potentially moving towards viable and usable nuclear fusion, which is potentially a game changer. China's really leading on all of that, as well as reforestation, as well as electronic vehicles, as well as biodiversity protection. So that will be, that's extremely important for all of humanity. And I think that's something that is really important to kind of keep our eyes on and to encourage our governments to engage with, because we all need to be, we're all in that project together. I think, there's very interesting changes afoot in terms of international relations and geopolitics. China's role in this emerging multipolarity, which I think, socialist China is really at the core of this multipolar process, which is historically, I would say, I don't want to speak in overly kind of highfalutin terms, but in my view, it's creating space for a post-imperialist future. The emergence and expansion of BRICS, the elevation of China's relations with the socialist countries, with the countries of the global south. Most recently, we've obviously seen important elevation in the status of relationship between China and Venezuela, between China and Nicaragua, just a couple of days ago between China and Zambia. Then, we're seeing the expansion of the Belt and Road, which we're currently marking 10 years since the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. That's already proving to be a game changer, especially in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean. Like, it's creating the possibility for countries to break out of underdevelopment, whereas European and American colonialism held these countries precisely in underdevelopment. There's a reason Walter Rodney called his book How the West Underdeveloped Africa. It was an intentional and systematic thing that contributing to the West's development by holding so much of the rest of the world in forced underdevelopment. China's creating space for actual development and modernization and industrialization, and increasingly to do so in a green and environmentally friendly way. So these are really important developments. Obviously, in terms of what we should be following, like the new Cold War, I think is a material fact at this point. And that's kind of a news story and a process that relates to China, which is crucially important for us to follow and ultimately very important for those of us in the West to oppose and expose the dangers of.
Carlos, I'd like to thank you so much for being on the show. I'm certain that our listeners have learned something new from our talk today. Again, I recommend people check out his most recent work, which is entitled The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. We did have a great conversation here, but to be honest, we barely scratched the surface of what's actually covered in the book. On each of the questions I essentially asked, there's at least a chapter, if not more, on that specific subject. So please do check it out. Any last words, Carlos, before I let you go?
No, thank you very much for having me on and for listening to me ramble for quite as long as I have. I hope people will check out the book. You can get it from the Red Letters, I think it's redletterspp.com website, or if not from there, then it's available in all the usual places. And I think it's also available on Kindle. I hope it's kind of useful in some way. People are not going to agree with all of it, but maybe they'll agree with some of it. And I hope to look forward to hearing people's feedback, including negative feedback and constructive criticism. And thanks again.